Hello and welcome viewers to a video on the historical world of Kingdom Come Deliverance II. This is something that I think is very important to cover because KCD2 is at its heart a historical role-playing game, but this is a part of history that I don't think a lot of people, especially in the United States, are particularly familiar with. And if you enjoy content like this about medieval gaming and medieval history, go ahead and hit the like and subscribe buttons. Before we get started, I want to say that a lot of this period is pretty poorly recorded, and the records that do exist are often somewhat contradictory. I've done my best to piece this together based on the available records and what might make sense given my knowledge of the Middle Ages and how politics at this time generally worked. However, it's certainly quite possible for there to be some inaccuracies, and please feel free to write in the comment section and point those out to me. Now, let's go ahead and get started. So first of all, let's go into a little background on the world that KCD2 takes place in. At this point in time, Bohemia was a kingdom, but it was also one of the electorates, really, of the Holy Roman Empire. It had been bequeathed by the Emperor Charles IV to his son Wenceslas IV, who was also intended to inherit the title of Holy Roman Emperor. It is important to remember this as a lot of the conflict in Bohemia that we play through in the game can be framed much better in the context of struggles over the imperial title, with Bohemia just having the misfortune of getting caught in the middle. Emperor Charles's younger son, Sigismund, was originally named as the Margrave of Brandenburg, a title that he later gave away to Jobst of Moravia due to financial necessity and some dynastic politics. Sigismund himself had married Mary of Hungary, who was the daughter and heir of King Louis the Great of Hungary, and when King Louis died, Mary was named queen, and eventually Sigismund gained enough support from the Hungarian nobles to be crowned king. However, there was substantial opposition to this succession, led by the Horvats, with a healthy assist from the King of Bosnia, and it actually took about 8 years of warfare before this was finally suppressed in 1395. The same year that Sigismund's wife Mary died, she was pregnant with their child, and she got into a riding accident, and both her and the child perished. Sigismund also remained involved in Bohemian politics during this period, switching sides frequently between different factions that either supported or opposed his brother Wenceslas. The next year, in 1396, Sigismund led the Crusade of Nicopolis, which is mentioned in Kingdom Come by Father Godwin and quite a few others. This crusade was generously termed a disaster. The crusade was very popular in Hungary and France, as well as other parts of Europe, and chroniclers estimate that Sigismund's army numbered somewhere around 90,000, and the Ottomans anywhere from 60,000 to 200,000. Obviously, all of these numbers are highly inflated, especially given that the countryside around Nicopolis, which both armies would have relied heavily on for supplies, couldn't really have supported tens of thousands, let alone hundreds of thousands of men and horses. The real numbers are probably closer to 15 to 20,000 for each side, with 30 to 40,000 involved in the actual fighting. Whatever the actual numbers, dissensions and distrust between the Hungarians and the French led to poor battlefield coordination, and on the 25th of September in 1396, the Crusaders were soundly and totally defeated. Sigismund himself would later blame this on the French and their inability to follow orders, and this was probably fair since it was the French Philip Artois, Constable of France, who had ordered a unilateral advance, and he ordered this unilateral advance because he was worried that Sigismund and the Hungarians would hoard all the glory. Sigismund did manage to escape, unlike most of the other nobles involved, but this defeat caused deep distrust and unrest within Hungary itself. It was also in 1396 that Sigismund first intervened in Bohemia, and at this point Wenceslaus was probably relatively okay with this. While Sigismund had been consolidating control over Hungary and failing as a crusader, Wenceslaus had been steadily irritating the Bohemian nobility. And a lot of this was centered around the appointment of high-ranking officials. Bohemian nobles viewed this as their right to hold these titles because of their ancient nobility, but Wenceslaus often appointed lesser nobles or even commoners to these important positions. And this is actually referenced in the game by figures like Sir Radzig and the Rutards, who were insinuated to be relatively low-ranking figures before the king elevated them to more important positions. And we'll talk about Radzig a little bit more later on. In addition, Wenceslaus had also been involved in an ugly argument over the investiture for the abbot of Clatterby in 1393. Arguments over investiture were quite common in medieval Europe, as it was an area that was often held to be the church's prerogative, but most medieval kings weren't too happy when there was another power, in this case the church, appointing leaders within the king's own lands. However, what was not so common was that Wenceslaus's officials, on his orders, tortured and murdered the Archbishop of Prague's vicar general. This action, combined with simmering resentment over appointments, led the Bohemian nobles to rebel. It was in 1394 Wenceslaus had been arrested in Jobst, Moravia, named as regent of Bohemia. It was in 1396 that Sigismund negotiated a truce that saw Wenceslaus restored to his throne. It was at this point that Wenceslaus named Sigismund as his vicar general of Germany, which, that title in the Holy Roman Empire, indicated a high-level official designated to act on the emperor's behalf. More importantly, Sigismund was designated as Wenceslaus's heir, which was likely Sigismund's overall goal. This made him legitimate heir not just to Bohemia, but to the Holy Roman Empire as well. Unfortunately, King Wenceslaus was viewed poorly throughout the rest of the Holy Roman Empire as well. A part of this was due to his inability to prevent internal wars, such as that between Bavaria and the Swabian League, and his withdrawal of support for Pope Boniface in the Papal Schism. Wenceslaus withdrew his support along with the French king in order to push for the election of a new single pope. In addition, due to the ambivalence of the German princes, as well as his significant problems in Bohemia, Wenceslaus had never actually been crowned as the Holy Roman Emperor. I think at this point it's worthwhile to consider the character of King Wenceslaus and King Sigismund. In the Kingdom Come series, Sigismund is generally portrayed as a bad guy who is tyrannical and untrustworthy, whereas Wenceslaus is a good guy, but generally a poor or incompetent ruler. In the case of Wenceslaus, this is a prevailing view from historians as well. However, I'd argue that Wenceslaus was not necessarily as incompetent as portrayed, nor as good as portrayed. This is a man who ordered the Archbishop's representative, the Vicar General, to be tortured and drowned in a river, which isn't exactly typical good person behavior. In addition, while Wenceslaus did enjoy his quiet hunting lodges and castles more than public life, his main issue seems to have been obtaining titular control of his father's vast lands without the resources to actually control them. Charles IV had held vast lands including Luxembourg, Bohemia, Moravia, and Brandenburg, and out of these lands Wenceslaus only inherited Bohemia, meaning that he had significantly fewer resources to call upon. He also inherited a scheming family, especially Jobst and Sigismund, as well as general disorder within the empire, such as the simmering conflicts between the traditional landed nobility and the city-states, as well as a papal schism, threats from the Ottoman Turks, and the general mess of politics within the Holy Roman Empire, which were an absolute quagmire on the best of days. Wenceslaus compounded this by his actions that angered the Bohemian nobles, which meant that he had no way to gain or impose his will on the empire at large. Even if he had the support of Bohemia, however, he would have struggled with just Bohemia to impose his rule on the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire. And thus, while Wenceslaus's personal shortcomings certainly contributed to his problems, he also inherited a situation that even the greatest leaders of history would likely have struggled with. On the other hand, King Sigismund is done pretty dirty by the Kingdom Come series. While his invasion of Bohemia did involve substantial raiding and pillaging, this was pretty par for the course with medieval warfare at the time, and that's actually referenced in KCD2 by the Dry Devil and Zizka. In reality, Sigismund was a visionary in many ways who envisioned a rebirth of great German kingship. He also saw the need for reforms both in the imperial system and in the church. Unfortunately, he was hindered in acting on his own vision by the instability of the times, as well as several mistakes that he made, which led to his own undoing. But despite these mistakes, Sigismund was still able to build a massive empire in Central Europe that would closely mirror what the Austrian Habsburgs would eventually rule. In fact, the Habsburgs were the ones that would eventually carry out Sigismund's vision for reforming the imperial system. In some ways, I really wish there was an option in KCD for Henry to decide to support King Sigismund instead of Wenceslaus, although I do know that this would run contrary to the story of him being the illegitimate son of Saratzig. But I do think that KCD2 does a really good job of showing an alternative perspective to this conflict, especially through that final conversation with von Aulitz. Anyway, back to the history. In 1400, the situation in the empire came to a head when four electors, Count Rupert of the Palatinate and the archbishops of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, all demanded that Wenceslaus appear and answer charges of neglect and failing to maintain public peace and order. Given the tenuous situation in Bohemia, which was quiet but tense, Wenceslaus refused to travel to meet them, and so these electors deposed him as Holy Roman Emperor and instead elected Count Rupert in his stead. Wenceslaus naturally opposed this, but lacked the resources to do anything about it, especially since the Bohemian nobles was still upset with him, in part because Wenceslaus was not honoring the concessions he had promised them in 1396. To attempt to gain support both to control Bohemia and likely to challenge Rupert as well, Wenceslaus granted Sigismund additional powers in Bohemia, possibly up to and including granting him some sort of regency. And this gave Sigismund the outlet that he needed, since he himself had been facing opposition in Hungary. In fact, on Sigismund's return to Hungary in 1401, he had been imprisoned by his own nobles and deposed twice. And although he had somewhat recovered, dissatisfaction was running high, and many nobles were actively looking for a potential replacement. And so Sigismund began to take control of castles in Bohemia somewhere around 1401, citing the additional privileges that Wenceslaus had given him. However, giving up castles and towns was not exactly what Wenceslaus had in mind, and so he and some of his loyal nobles decided to resist. So in 1402, Sigismund captured and arrested Wenceslaus at Prague Castle. Actually, whether he was captured or arrested might sort of depend on which particular chronicler you choose to believe. But at this point, it is likely that Sigismund actually intended to escort Wenceslaus to Rome and have him crowned as Holy Roman Emperor. And allow me to divert a bit to explain this, because it may not make sense to some people. So at this time, both Sigismund and Wenceslaus viewed the title of emperor as being the title of paramount importance. This was the real legacy that had been bequeathed to them by their father, whereas Bohemia and Hungary were more just personal domains. The deposition of Wenceslaus was a serious affair for both men, and Sigismund was likely angered that his brother didn't take firm action to either crown himself or crush Rupert of the Palatinate. Taking Wenceslaus by force or otherwise to have him crowned in Rome was a logical move. As the emperor anointed by the Pope at Rome, even if you take into account the schism, that would have given Wenceslaus a strong political and propaganda advantage. Remember also that Sigismund was Wenceslaus's heir, which means that propping up his brother's claim to the empire was important to Sigismund. And this is because inheriting a title via right or via birthright or whatever was almost always preferable to inheriting a title via force of arms. Unfortunately for Sigismund, Rupert got wind of this plan and made moves to block any travel into or through Italy. Without the resources to force this passage, Sigismund instead was forced to imprison Wenceslaus at various locations, eventually settling him in Vienna under the control of the Dukes of Austria. In November of 1402, he got Wenceslaus to agree to sign over his powers to Sigismund in return for better conditions of imprisonment, which allowed Sigismund to effectively declare himself King of Bohemia. From here, the situation becomes a bit more murky. Sources that I read differed, some stating that Sigismund invaded Bohemia in 1402, shortly after deposing Wenceslaus, and some stating that he invaded in 1403. The likely reason for this is because Sigismund originally relied heavily on his Bohemian allies, such as Markvart von Aulitz, to prosecute this war, and in part this was because Sigismund likely intended to escort Wenceslaus to Italy in the second half of 1402, and therefore had not bothered to raise his Hungarian forces. Given the time taken to raise an army in Hungary and then march them into Bohemia, this would have left his Hungarians with precious little campaigning time before the winter in 1402. So instead, what likely happened is Sigismund raised his Hungarian forces to start the campaigning season in 1403, and instead relied heavily on his Bohemian supporters in 1402. Whatever the case, 1402 saw plenty of fighting, which culminated in December with the siege and attack of Kutnahora, which is Kuttenberg in the game. And this was defended pretty staunchly by its residents. This siege was actually commanded by Markfart von Aulitz, who commanded an army that indeed was sent from Prague. While the siege was successful, it was a bittersweet victory for Sigismund, as von Aulitz was shot with a crossbow and died on the 27th of December 1403. And this is one area that is inaccurate in KCD2, as von Aulitz had died months before the story begins. However, this is a case where I'm really fine with this little deviation, as his storyline in KCD2 is, in my opinion, one of the best and deepest in the game. Definitely don't miss this quest towards the end. In 1403, Sigismund renewed his campaign in Bohemia, likely now reinforced by some of his Hungarian followers and some Cuman mercenaries. In March of 1403, his army sacked Skalitz, likely targeting it due to its silver mines, and also because the ruler, Sir Radzig, was known to be a staunch supporter and possibly a friend to King Wenceslaus. I think here it's worth diverting to the historical Sir Radzig. In reality, Radzig had only been named Burgrave of Skalitz Castle at the start of 1403, which means he would have had been little known to the locals when the sack occurred a few months later, much less had time to leave Henry there years ago to be raised by the town blacksmith. Prior to being named Burgrave, not much is really known of him, but he was believed to have been a minor knight in the service of Prokop of Moravia. There is even some evidence that he might have been a robber knight. Given his appointment as Burgrave of Skalitz, it is likely he was a friend of King Wenceslaus, though this isn't certain. In many ways, as a minor lord who was raised to an important position, Radzig exemplifies what so alienated many of the established Bohemian nobles. This was also possibly a reason that Sigismund targeted Skalitz. Radzig was seen as an outsider by the established nobility, and so sacking Skalitz would send a message of fear to his enemies without angering the Bohemian nobles by actively targeting someone that they viewed as being one of their own. Anyway, shortly after the sack of Skalitz, a truce was arranged between Sigismund and the opposition, which lasted from the 14th of April to the 20th of May in 1403. It's during this truce that the events of KCD2 start, with our heroes headed to meet with Otto von Berghof. Just as like in the game, Jobst and his allies used this time to rally and prepare their forces, and when the truce ended, there was very little fighting, as Sigismund realized he was facing a renewed coalition. This renewed coalition was also exacerbated by a new threat in Hungary, with the arrival of Ladislaus of Naples, who invaded Hungary and besieged and would eventually capture the city of Zara. Sigismund withdrew his forces to face this new threat. While the exact timeline of this isn't known, Sigismund was definitely in Bratislava, which was then part of the Kingdom of Hungary, by the end of July, and this is where the storyline of Kingdom Come Deliverance II ends, with the withdrawal of Sigismund's army. So in the near future, after the events of KCD2, Ladislaus would capture Zara and have himself crowned King of Hungary there, but he never really pushed his military campaign much further. At its height, his kingdom in Hungary really only ever extended to the area around Zara. Sigismund, on the other hand, would go on to eventually be crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and would found a very powerful Central European state that would eventually be taken over and ruled by the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family. King Wenceslaus would either escape with the aid of John of Liechtenstein or be released from captivity by Sigismund in November of 1403. This discrepancy is likely due to orders that Sigismund had given to release Wenceslaus from close captivity, after which Wenceslaus absconded from Vienna with John's assistance. Wenceslaus refused to acknowledge that he had been deposed as emperor, even though both Jobst and Sigismund would later be elected to the position. Eventually, in 1411, Wenceslaus would relinquish the imperial title to Sigismund in exchange for guarantees that he could keep Bohemia, where he would continue to struggle for another few years with trying to rule the nobility there. And that brings us to the end of our story. Overall, I'm very impressed by the historical accuracies of Kingdom Come as a franchise. While they do take some liberties, such as with Ratzig and with Fong Aulitz, these liberties are quite minor, done in a way that furthers the overall story of the game without directly tearing down the historical foundations. I hope this video was helpful and enjoyable. As always, feel free to leave comments below, and until next time, take care.